Past trauma can definitely play a role in our relationships. And have you ever found where maybe you're in a situation and you're starting a new relationship and it just wasn't going the way you wanted? It felt as if you were taking all your baggage from childhood, from previous relationships, and bringing it into this new relationship. Or it could even be in a relationship with an adult, with a sibling, adult parent. It can be a best friend. It can be all kinds of relationships where you aren't having those meaningful connections that you desire. Maybe you don't even know that you desire to have deep intimacy with these people, but you know something feels off in the way that you relate because you feel lonely. You might be numbing with wine or Netflix or food, but something feels missing in your relationships. Today, I have Dr. Charleanea with me again. She's been on Masks Off for People Pleasers and Perfectionists before, and I had the pleasure of being on her podcast as well. She is a licensed therapist, and I'm going to let her introduce herself a little bit more to you in her own words, and then we're going to dive deep today into sharing our own personal experiences, but also Dr. Charlena's professional experience to help you learn how to get out of the prison, air quotes, the prison of the mind, or prison as in being trapped. A couple of tools that you can use so that you can have more of that paradise. So I'm always talking about prison to paradise, victimhood to freedom, and being more empowered. Welcome, Dr. Charlene. So glad to have you back.
Thank you, Kim. I love being here. And boy, you're in my domain. We're going to be talking about a lot of things that are in my backyard. I'll introduce myself first before we dive into the
Please.
topic a little bit more deeply. Again, I'm Dr. Charleanea Ariano. I am a licensed psychologist, a transformational life and leadership coach, an inspirational speaker, and an author. And one of my actual expertise is couples. Relationships are more than just intimate relationships. We have familiar relationships, family, other friend relationships, collegial relationships. I mean, we are always in relationship, whether it's to ourselves or to others. You know, this is going to be a hot topic, and I'm really excited to talk about it. I've got lots of personal experience as well as professional experience in this arena.
Well, and I know that you do because you shared that. And thank you so much for giving that introduction. So, why don't we start there so that the listeners who may be new to listening to you, maybe they didn't hear you on the last episode, so that they can get a little bit more of your background, maybe just how trauma and childhood wounds played out in some of your more closer relationships in a negative way. Let's start with that so that people can really connect to what the issue is.
Absolutely. Oftentimes, I'll start with the trauma, Kim. Most trauma, not all trauma, but most trauma actually occurs in the context of some kind of relationship,
Mm.
whether it's relationship with our caregivers, with another adult, with other children or peers. It usually happens in the context of relationship. And so what
Mm.
ends up happening is it really kind of shakes the foundation of the relationship. It can create these fissures or fractures in the relationship. And, you know, relationships are built on trust. If there's a trauma, betrayal, then the foundation of trust is shaky. So that's one thing to consider. The other thing to consider is the way our minds work, especially
Mm.
when we're younger. Our minds are open, they're sponges, taking in every piece of information they can because we're quickly developing a blueprint for life. How
Mm.
does life work? What am I learning about myself, about life, and how it works? The brain is very efficient in taking that information in and setting up a blueprint. for how we navigate through the world. Why do I tell you this? I've done a lot of couples work and family relationship work, and this often comes up. It's like, oh, the past is the past. We just need to leave this behind us and move forward. That's not possible. Why? It's the way that our mind operates. It takes past experience. That's how we decide how the world works.
Mm.
And so, whatever our past experience is, that's what we're going to take with us as the blueprint. For those of us like myself, I came from a background with a lot of childhood trauma. There was neglect, there was abuse, there was abandonment. And so I can tell you without a shadow of a doubt, the way those traumatic experiences impacted my worldview, my blueprint of relationships. Initially, before I did all my work and healing, I had this narrative that people couldn't be trusted, that I couldn't rely on anybody, that people were not dependable. Because I believed those things out of my trauma, it impacted the way I showed up and my level of openness and vulnerability in relationships. I'm not alone. We all do this to some
Yeah.
degree or another.
Yeah, I love that. Here's another point that I want to bring in because I think so many people can get caught when they're in their relationships and it's not going well with the other. I was one who could get caught in blaming the other. Let's say we are talking about an intimate relationship. When I was dissatisfied, unhappy, or I would blame my husband. It was always like he was the one triggering me. Or when I was growing up, my mom was triggering me because she said something that was degrading or belittling. When I started to experience that in my marriage, my relationship, I was taking everything so personally and thinking he was doing all of this to me. Now, caveat to that, there are times when people do say and do things that are really shitty and they shouldn't. But the reality was he was just triggering something within me that was created in that blueprint that you spoke of that happened with my mom. And so my feeling, my understanding, and I would love to hear your thoughts on it, is that oftentimes these relationships are there to help us heal and grow ourselves up from those past traumas, those childhood wounds. So, in other words, I was reenacting my unhealthy relationship with my mom in my relationship with my husband. And as I was definitely a people pleaser. So, in order to heal from those patterns and overcome those patterns, I had to keep getting triggered by my husband so that I could show up differently and heal that past. Just because something happened in the past doesn't mean it stays in the past. It comes with us. We're carrying our suitcase with all of our baggage. I think that's what I'm trying to illustrate with my own example. Just wonder what your thoughts are on that.
There's a lot of things that you touched on that I think resonate for me, Kim. One of those things is we are wired for growth. We're wired for
Mm.
growth. We're wired for evolution. As a person, we're always looking, we're always striving for mastery. Now, sometimes what can happen is people can say, oh, that's not true. That's not my experience. Well, the reason they may not be their experience is it's been shut down. There could be some trauma around that and they're
Mm.
disconnected. I genuinely believe we are wired to heal, grow, and evolve. So we are looking for mastery. I'm also going to make a connection when children, being a child therapist as well in my distant past, one of the things that we would look at is children's play. Children would repeat scripts. I remember working with this 4-year-old. This was back 30 years ago. Every time he would play, he would take the mommy and daddy and put them up on the roof, and the kid would be lost. It was like, okay, this is a little transparent. What's interesting is that desire to master. Kids will repeat stories over and over again in their play as an attempt to master it. Well, interestingly, that doesn't go away as an adult. We still try to master experiences and things that have created traumas or wounds in us. we will seek to master those experiences. So, what happens when we do that? First of all, we choose partners. And this is subconscious at best and sometimes unconscious. We will choose partners that present something familiar. And typically, that familiarity is whatever the wound or wounds are with our caretaker. So, like you had said, your difficulties with your mother and that experience, you were projecting it onto the relationship. And so, when I think about relationships, I think of mastery, projection, and mirroring. Those three things are really critical elements of relationship. Typically, what I mean by mirroring is our partner will be the mirror for the things that are inside of us that are wounded or unhealed. We will see those. Sometimes we make a mistake and think our partner is doing something to us, when in reality, our partner is only holding up a mirror so that we can see the parts of ourselves that are wounded. It's important to recognize that in our partner, and the lens that we're wearing is from our trauma. So we see through that, and that's how we interpret that behavior. That's projection.
Hey, it's Kim here, interrupting your regularly scheduled podcast episode to let you know about an opportunity to go deeper into this work. I invite you to head over to Amazon.com and pick up your copy of my book, Free to Be: A Pathway to Inner Liberation. If you are looking to unhook from people-pleasing and perfectionistic patterns, if you're looking to have a better way of identifying your patterns and then how you can unhook so you can be free to step outside your comfort zone, free to have more meaningful relationships in your life, free to be your true self without hiding behind a mask any longer. If you desire any of this, then I encourage you to pick up your copy. And if you enjoy my book as much as I loved writing it, please go on over and leave a review on Amazon. You can leave a star review or written review. Now back to your regularly scheduled podcast episode.
Okay, can we pause there for a second? Because I think this is
Absolutely.
a super important point. Let's go over this again, this mirroring piece. So you said we might see a behavior in our partner and we think that they're doing something to us. Therefore, we're taking it personally, like, oh, how dare you? Why is he always doing this? Why is she always doing this? But in reality, what I hear you saying is that it's an opportunity for me or someone else to look in the mirror. So, what if the behavior is a negative behavior? So, let's say the behavior is one of being overly critical or judgmental. Does that mean if my partner is behaving that way, is it because that's within me to be super judgmental and critical? Or is it like, oh, I see this behavior, I need to learn how to assert myself and set a boundary and not allow that kind of behavior? Can you explain a little bit the nuance of the mirroring?
Absolutely. It's interesting you brought up the example of being critical. Relationships, first of all, intimate relationships are the hardest things we ever do in our lives.
They really are.
Why is it complicated? Person A has their trauma, their projections, their unfinished business, and partner B has exactly the same thing. So in the space, you have all the shit. And sometimes it's hard to determine what's mine and what's yours. When you talk about the partner being critical, something to consider is, if I don't come from a background where a parent was really critical, it's going to slide off my back like water off a duck's back. It's not going to bother me. But if I have unfinished business or a wound around a parent being overly critical, then that's going to stick. And by the same token, let's flip it. The way that my partner is acting, let's say my partner is being overly critical, that could be his or her own projection because that's their stuff. Maybe they grew up in an overly critical household and they have internalized that. They're being critical. So they're projecting their stuff into the space as well.
You're 100% right. I think it's really important to break this down because I think so many people can just, again, I said this in the beginning, that just get caught in, and probably couples particularly, like you did this, you're doing that, like you get interlocked in this dance and think you're intentionally hurting one another and trying to make life difficult when in actuality, what's really happening is everybody's stuff is coming up. That's why
Mhm.
you interlock in this dance and can feel trapped. Oftentimes, I know I did personally for years. I just wanted my husband to change. I was doing my
That
growth
was the
work,
answer, right?
right? I wanted my mom to change and I wanted my family to change. Now, mind you, I was still doing my personal growth work, but back in the beginning, when it was still really painful and really difficult, I didn't understand what you and I are talking about right now. I didn't have that knowledge, which is why I think these podcasts are so incredibly amazing. Someone who may not be privy to what you're speaking of can be like, oh my God, holy shit. I thought it was just the way we were with each other, but there's actually a reason why we're fighting all the time. There's actually a reason why we're locked in this dance and we can't get out of it. And there's a reason why I feel so trapped, right? So there's this feeling of being trapped and being stuck. And now there's one, you can have this awareness and learn. What are like some other things, tools to go from the prison to the paradise that one could do if they were listening to this episode and they are saying to themselves, oh my God, yeah, I feel so trapped in my relationship, or the way my relationship is with my adult sister, my adult brother, we've been locked into this pattern for decades. Healthier relationship with my sister. I want a healthier relationship with my friends. I want intimacy, emotional intimacy, and I can't get there because I'm caught. What are some beginning steps that one can take?
It's a great question, Kim. And I'm going to say something that's probably not very popular and might get a rise out of people. First and foremost, the absolute first step when you're struggling in a relationship and you feel kind of stuck in patterns, it's not to focus outside of you. You know, a lot of times it's natural, it's human nature, it's the way our ego works. Our ego is looking for things outside of us that threaten us. In order to have self mastery, it's important for us to recognize that that's just the way we're wired. It's part of our self preservation system. And yet at the same time, we have a higher version of ourselves that can override that system. That's important. When we make a mistake, we believe that it's happening outside of us and it's happening to us. In reality, our experience is coming from within. I hear this ad nauseum when I do couples work. Almost every couple comes in, and one of the things that is either spoken out loud or it's in the room is, I need my partner to change.
I've been there.
That's bullshit. I'm just
Yeah,
going to call it. That's
it is.
bullshit. You do not need anybody to change. What needs to happen is you need to focus on yourself. If something happens and it gets you activated, it gets you triggered, the question to ask yourself is, what is going on inside of me? What is it triggering? What is it reminding me of? When do I first remember having this experience? Because when you're able to do that, you will actually connect with the part of you that is wounded, and you are responsible for healing that part and giving that part of yourself whatever it needs, not your partner. It's great when your partner can do it, but it's not required and it should not be expected.
Okay, I love that. Of course, I'm 100% behind doing the inner work, and it's always about turning the arrow and looking in. So, in your opinion and your own personal experience, do you feel as if you can ever get to the point where the wounds are healed and then you're no longer triggered by that partner of yours? Or is
Mhm.
it lifelong?
That's a great question. I absolutely believe that it's possible to heal these things and not be triggered anymore. Now, it's also possible that you can have variations of that. For example, I've been in my own relationship we're in our 25th year.
Wow.
In the beginning of our relationship, I would get triggered anytime my partner would be on the road and I wouldn't hear from my partner. And my abandonment stuff would come up. I played out that tape for years and years. And I did my personal work. And I've gotten to a point where that doesn't trigger me anymore. My partner can go out of town. I might not hear from my partner, and I don't have those abandonment feelings get triggered. I also want to be very careful about saying that, because what I don't want the listeners to believe is that if I don't get to the point where I'm not triggered, then somehow I'm failing. What I have found in my personal experience is that there are wounds that you can completely heal and not get triggered at all. And then there are wounds that can stick around and you can still get triggered. The good news is, with the work you do, you recognize it quicker, you get less triggered, you recover more quickly, and you can advocate for yourself. And I think that's important as well. So it's a process, it's an unfolding, and you can be anywhere along that path, and it's still progress and it's still healing.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you added that little caveat, because this is masks off for people pleasers and perfectionists. So there's lots of perfectionists listening. We want to be mindful of, it's progress and not perfection, and not to put that kind of pressure and blame on yourself. So I'm glad you brought that up. And I want to circle back to that same question. So you use the situation where you worked through your abandonment issues and you got to a point where you were no longer triggered when your partner went on trips because you healed. Great, got it. So now that wound is healed up. No more pussing, no more infection.
Mm-hmm.
Is there, in your opinion, personal or professional, a time when you would say you have done all of your growth, not all, because that's a lifelong thing, but you've done a shit ton of growth work, personal growth work. And as you're growing and healing, you're moving along your path, but best friend of 20 years hasn't really moved that far. Your partner isn't doing the growth work and isn't coming along with you. Maybe it's your sibling. Is there a time when you're wanting deeper emotional intimacy, like that real healthy connection with another? And one is healing, one isn't. Can that relationship, like, when do you know it's like, okay, done? You and I talked before we recorded, we talked about the inner circles. I remember you saying that some people maybe have to go on the outer circle, or acquaintances are on the far outer circle. Is there a time when these people that are on your inner circle and you've been trying to connect with them on a deeper level and it's just not happening? Maybe for whatever reason, could be their woundedness, could be maybe if it's me, maybe I'm not showing up in a good way to try to get that intimacy going, because I've had intimacy issues too. Do you know what I'm trying to ask? Is there a time when you're like, and how do you know if it's like it's not worth it anymore?
That's a really great question. I don't know if I can give you a really black and white answer, but I'll do my best to have a
Nuanced is
clear
fine.
answer.
That's why I say it could be from your personal experience or professional. I think people want to know, how do I know when to walk away from this person?
Well, and it's a great question. It's a question that a lot of my clients ask. And quite frankly, it's a question that I've dealt with in my own life. One of the things that I often tell my clients is we all have an innate, deep desire for connection and closeness. At the same time, it's really important for us to take care of ourselves and protect ourselves from harm. What I often tell my clients is I'm not going to ever tell my clients to get rid of somebody in their lives. That
Right.
is not my job.
Mm-mm.
That's an overstep of boundaries. What I will tell my clients is you have this balance, and the balance is protection versus connection. And you decide how important is the connection to this person What are you willing to do? What are you not willing to do? And at the same time, having your protection as well. And where are your lines? And I've worked through this with clients. For example, a really common relationship is with a parent who has not done any work and presents with a lot of dysfunction. And yet we want to be connected to our parents. That feeling doesn't ever go away. That need doesn't ever go away. Yet, let's say the parent has a lot of dysfunction. I've worked with my clients navigating that line where it's like, okay, what boundary do you need to put? Where you're talking about the circles, that your parent isn't in the inner circle. They might be down out 4 or 5 circles. It's interesting that we talk about this today. I look at my life and relationships that I have that are familial. I have ridden that ride for a while, and I've gotten to the point where, for example, I have a brother that I have not spoken to in 11 years. I made the decision to end the relationship because I could not be connected to him in any meaningful way without being harmed. And there was no way for me to navigate it. So I ended the relationship. My mother, I love dearly, and yet I have her out quite a distance. I continue to have communication with her, but I have a very distant relationship with her, again, because I'm protecting myself from harm. I'll give another example, which I think is interesting. I have a friend. We had been friends for over 30 years. I thought this was going to be the do or die kind of friend, right? That we would be together forever, and ended up ending that relationship last spring. And we didn't have a falling out. There was no harm. I recognized I was growing, I was evolving. I wanted more meaningful connection. I wanted more vulnerability. And it was clear to me that she was not able to do it. She wasn't willing to take risks to be vulnerable. The writing was on the wall. And we said very lovingly and kindly, this just isn't working for us anymore. We walked away. And again, there was no harm. It was just clear that we weren't on the same paths and we're too far apart to really connect.
First of all, I love both examples. Thank you so much for bringing up both, because I want to say something to the mother relationship, right? You said you were honest. You shared with us that you love your mother dearly, but you have her out here, and your brother is you haven't spoken to in 11 years. So I think it's so important for you to be so honest about that, because as people pleasers and perfectionists who are listening to this episode, some might be feeling like, oh my God, I can't do that to my mother. I can't set boundaries and say no and put space and distance. She'll be so mad and so angry at me, and what's going to happen to our relationship. By you sharing, and I concur and I support what you shared, is, in my opinion, helping the listener to have permission to know that it is okay. We're talking about relationships that can have a lot of dysfunction. If you grew up in a codependent, dysfunctional home, and you're doing the work to heal and grow, evolve, and master certain skills and overcome your patterns, this is part of it. This is a big, huge part of it. So I love that you shared that. And then I love your example with the friendship. There wasn't really a conflict or a falling out. There wasn't anything she did to you or you did to her that precipitated the decision to end the relationship. You decided for yourself that you wanted to have more intimacy and vulnerability. That's what my episode is about last week, cultivating more intimacy and connection with female friendships. I have a friend where we have been so intentional about trying to work on having more emotional intimacy. That can mean sharing something with the other that might actually even end up upsetting them. Like we're talking about calling forth instead of calling out. If there's something I was doing that was triggering her, we have boundaries, we have language that's set up so that she can say it to me or I can say it to her, because otherwise, if we don't share how we honestly feel, there's the risk that your heart is going to start to calcify. If you're not sharing from your heart, you start coming on this surface level, like, oh, how's the weather? And, just keep it up there all the time, which is what I ended up doing with my parents because I couldn't go to the more vulnerable, intimate places of sharing what was in my heart because it wasn't safe. It was not safe. I learned as a little girl it wasn't safe. And that's what you were talking about too. That's setting the boundaries. And that's such a great tool. Brene Brown says it's loving with a smart heart. Someone has to earn the right for you to be vulnerable with them.
Mhm.
You have to have
Mhm.
that safe space. So now that we've talked about what the prison looks like, we've given some tools to start working on. In your opinion, what does the paradise look like when you or someone else can start to have these more meaningful, close, intimate relationships and you're working on yourself and you're able to have open communication? What's the potential?
That's a great question. First and foremost, what is the first step into paradise? And I believe that that's ownership. And what I mean by ownership, by the way, is the opposite of victimhood. Victimhood is about things are happening to us and the locus of control is outside of us. Ownership is about what is happening in me rather than to me. Taking ownership over your experience, whether you're triggered, what your needs are, what your boundaries are, and doing it in a way where you feel confident it is perfectly okay to do that. You said something a little bit ago about, oh no, I couldn't do that. It would make my mom mad or it would hurt her feelings. And as I was hearing that, it was like, oh boy, I've heard that one a million times. That's a form of codependency,
It is.
in the sense of deciding what is right for you based on somebody else's reaction. And when we take ownership, there's a sense of freedom with taking ownership. We're also modeling that for others to do the same. Then we only need to be worried about our own needs, our own emotional regulation, our own projections, rather than being concerned about those with whom we're in a relationship. And so I think ownership is really important. Number one, there's so much freedom in ownership. I think the second thing is when you do go inside and look at it with self-compassion and gratitude, because I think a lot of times we judge these, especially perfectionists, especially people pleasers, we judge these aspects of us. And in reality, these aspects of us are just wounded children doing the best they can. And they need our love, support, and participation in their healing. Our adult self, our higher self can journal around these experiences. When have I felt this before? It's important to understand where it comes from so we can do something with it.
I love what you're speaking to because all of it is my 5-step power pathway, which I have talked about on your podcast. And it's also the framework for my book that came out, the 5-step power pathway, which is being aware of patterns. We don't have to wallow in it, but it is helpful to be aware of where these patterns come from in order to go from victimhood to freedom. We have to take ownership. As long as we put the blame on somebody else or look for someone on the outside to do the work and change, we will stay in victimhood. It's about doing the healing work and healing the childhood wounds and integrating those parts with our adult self, our higher self, whatever term we want to call it. And so at the end of the day, I think it's what you said, freedom. And I say freedom, liberation. That's what's possible. Autonomy, agency over your own life. Instead of going through life and looking at your relationships like, oh my God, I have to see my mom, or I got to get on a call with my sister, or I don't really feel like having lunch with this friend, but I really should. That's how I spent my life living in that prison. I was in victimhood. I had no autonomy. So that's what's possible. I think you're outlining the same things. We're so in alignment with what we're saying, which is why I wanted to have you come back on. I mean, I've had 95 guests on this podcast since it started in 2020. And when I started to look at everyone that I had on and I was thinking about this topic and this conversation, I chose you.
Thank you. Thank you.
You are so welcome. Well, thank you again for being here and sharing not only your expertise, but your own personal stories, your own personal experience, which I think is as powerful as your professional experience and wisdom, because that's what people relate to when they say, oh, this is what, Dr. Charleanea was saying with her mom or her brother. That helps the listeners to know that they're not alone.
I've learned that it is important to share my story because listeners or those that we serve make an assumption that we've got a perfect life. They make an assumption that we got lucky.
Oh my God.
Yeah, I could look at my own life. My own life is what's prepared me for this personally and professionally. It's made me good at what I do because the journey I've been on has really helped me with this.
Yeah, I love that. The mess has become the mission, right? The mess
Mhm.
becomes the mission. So, it's a very complex topic. And we said that at the very beginning. This is only like a 30-40 minute episode. There's so much more that one can do and probably needs to do in order to heal themselves, to have more meaningful, connected relationships, to have the freedom we talked about. If someone was listening and saying, I really need some more help with this, how can they reach you, find you, and in what ways would you be able to help them?
Great question. This is right up my alley. This is the kind of work that I do. One of the ways that we get out of our own way is actually unpacking that suitcase and looking at what's in it. Because what happens is our traumas become our narratives. Our narratives define our world and our experience. It's important to unpack that suitcase and understand how our traumas translate into narratives that limit what we want to experience in life. This is exactly what I do in the work that I do. And I do one-on-one coaching, and I go into partnership with my clients and we do deep transformational work around healing these parts of ourselves and shifting our narratives. If anybody would like to work with me one-on-one or through my group coaching or workshops, they're welcome to reach out to me through my website, which is www.drcharleanea.com.
Awesome. And your podcast, you have a
Oh,
podcast?
yes. And if they would like to hear more from me talking about real issues, real shit that we're all facing today, they're welcome to join me on my podcast, which is called She Is Mother, and it is on all of the podcast platforms.
Is your book published? Is it out
It's
yet?
not published yet. No, I'm in the process of finding a literary agent to publish the book, but it is complete at this point. And I've actually started my second book, which is on intergenerational trauma.
Wow, fantastic.
Yes.
So there you have it. If you are ready to unpack your suitcase, by all means, reach out to Dr. Charleanea. If you enjoyed this episode as much as I enjoyed having it and creating it, then if you're on YouTube, leave a comment. If you have a question, put it in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you're on your favorite platform, leave a review. I am so excited to get this one out, and I will see you next time on Masks Off for People Pleasers and Perfectionists. Take care, everybody.
Hey, Kim Gross here. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Masks Off for People Pleasers and Perfectionists. I invite you to hop on over to my website, kimgrosscoaching.com. Right there on the front page, there's a quiz for people pleasers and perfectionists. You can find out if you have tendencies. You can also get into my newsletter where you will be given valuable content every week on different topics I share here in the podcast. And if you really did enjoy this episode, if you found it helpful, if you found it valuable, please go to, if you're on YouTube, Go and subscribe if you're listening on your favorite podcast platform. Then I invite you to leave a review. You can even do a star review. It doesn't have to be a written review. If you know of someone who can benefit from this podcast or this particular episode, please share it with them. I'll see you next time.